Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, lecturing theology at Catholic Studies Academy, in for Jason Gale. And I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy, who's done a good deal of work in the area of political philosophy. And that's a good thing, because today we'll be talking about monarchy and Christianity. Today's discussion is inspired by the recent passing of Queen Elizabeth II. In light of this historic moment, the end of a 70-year reign of a monumental figure, and perhaps the last monarch who will ever reign over a predominantly Christian Britain, we thought it would be valuable for our listeners to consider the historical, philosophical, and theological meaning and value of monarchy and why it's been a predominant form of governance in Christendom for, well, until very recently in history.
Sure.
So before we get started, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, subscribe to our channel, select notifications, and of course, share our content with your friends. So, Dr. Smith, why don't you get us started? What are your initial thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's good. We can think about monarchy in a lot of different ways. We can think about it sort of, kind of from a very abstract kind of taxonomy, right, of various regimes. It is good to think of it as a kind of regime that is a form of rulership. In classical political philosophy, we recognize that there are a whole variety of forms of government that can be exercised. We're very used to, of course, some form of polity or democracy. But nevertheless, historically, monarchy has been very prevalent throughout the world. And then especially interestingly enough, Christianity and the various Christian nations, historically, Christian monarchy in particular, has been a very prevalent model. And so I think it's, interesting to think about the realities of Christian monarchy in particular, right? What was it? What was it not? And I think it's especially useful for, 21st century people, especially maybe Americans. We have maybe a sort of a antipathy towards monarchy. As soon as we think of monarchy, we think of something sort of absolutist or tyrannical or something like that. And that's actually, I think, pretty far from the case when we look at the historical realities of Christian monarchy.
In the aggregate, right? So
that's right.
We can look at episodes where monarchs became tyrants.
Sure.
But that what you're saying, and I think this is right, I think it's not the norm, actually.
No, yeah. I mean, I think you can find, good and bad monarchies and monarchs, just like you can find good and bad presidents and senators. I mean,
right,
monarchy has no monopoly on corruption, right?
Right. Or I would say, nor does it have any monopoly on like tyranny, absolute dictatorship.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, if you think, interestingly, our modern forms of totalitarianism that we think about, really are party systems, where, basically a network of bureaucrats and state officials sort of take over, and you don't really have sort of the monarch in any traditional sense.
Yeah.
So I think it's good, though, to try to limit our discussion here to particularly Christian monarchy as it developed in the medieval period and really even into the modern period. I mean, I could think the last great Christian monarchs who are real monarchs would be in terms of wielding real power, right? Would be the monarchs who lost the First World War. Oddly enough, you think about the German Kaiser, you think about the Tsar. And you think about the Austro-Hungarian emperor, right? The last of the Habsburgs, right? Those, that's into the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
That you have, Christian monarchs with, real regal power, right? And into the early 20th century. So what do we want to say there about them? I think it's important to lay out some distinctions early on here. One is that there's a misperception that Christian monarchy is always tied up with the divine right of kings, right?
Yeah, right.
You hear that often. And that's not necessarily the case. In fact, I would say that that's the minority model, and in particular, an early Enlightenment and Renaissance view of monarchy. Um, Certainly, you could say from a Christian perspective that anybody who ends up in political leadership has a vocation, right?
Yeah.
To political leadership. Maybe depending on your view of providence, you could say that providentially they have this position, but that's a
Uh,
little different than the divine right. Divine
well,
right
I
is,
think,
yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So let me interrupt you there because we this is a difficult question because when you
Mhm,
say divine right,
mhm,
right, when those words come out of the mouth of a contemporary person, what they
mhm,
mean is, I mean, this is what I was taught about it when I was in
mhm.
school, was that the king could basically do whatever he wants um, because he has the authority of God. He's a complete autocrat.
That's right. That's right.
Um,
And tied into that
however,
is that he's selected by God,
yeah, right,
right? Very
right,
specifically and particularly. Good.
right. So, however, though, in the language of the church, the concept of divine right was a real thing, even in the
Hmm.
Middle Ages,
Hmm.
and but it didn't mean that,
That's right. Yeah, didn't
right?
mean this latter
And
point.
I want to
Yeah.
be clear on that because if we're digging through documents, we're digging through church statements,
Hmm.
right? We might come across this phrase "divine right,"
Hmm.
um, but actually, right, in the Middle Ages, divine right was a concept that controlled and limited the power of the monarch.
That's right.
It didn't unleash it in some absolute sense.
That's right. Yeah. And I think, we tend to associate divine right with that latter sort of absolutist model, right?
Yeah.
I would say that that's not correct. Now, you can say that any legitimate political regime, right?
Yeah.
So, any legitimate political regime, what do I mean by that? I mean by that any regime that promotes the common good in a way that's in keeping with the legal customs of that country,
Right.
um, which could be, right, a monarch, could be a republic, it could be an aristocracy, it could be a mixture of those things, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, that any legitimate regime has authority, right? That is not just the power to rule, but the moral right to command, right?
Because by God's design, human beings
Mm-hmm.
are made to live within the context of social and political organization.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah, correct. Um, uh, and so they have that right, uh, and in a sense, ultimately from God, right? You could
Mhm.
say from the natural law, from the eternal law, so that if you will look at sort of the very traditional was to think of the king as a minister of God's justice, right?
Uh-huh.
As kind of pulling on that Pauline language. But again, as you say, Rich, that both grounds the power of the regime. Again, whether it's a democracy or a monarchy, but also limits it, right?
Mhm.
So there is that sort of you know connection to authority, and authority ultimately from God. Like all authorities are established by God. That kind of idea, but
Yeah.
not in the absolutist sense of the divine right. So that's very important, I think, to understand for the medieval Christian monarchies and even early modern monarchies, right? That they did have authority, and that authority was thought to be grounded in a sort of divine claim, but it's not an absolutist claim.
Right. So I think what I'm kind of interested in right now is
Mm-hmm.
asking what is the value of
Mm-hmm.
monarchy as such? Why is it that um, this particular model of governance had really been favored for so long within Christendom?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have some theological answers to that question, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I know what the church has said about it,
Mm-hmm.
but
Sure.
it's very interesting that as new forms of government became more popular,
Mm-hmm.
um, the magisterium of the church was actually pretty resistant to the change.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like, well, things change and these
Right,
are
right.
totally legitimate innovations. We don't need monarchs.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't the attitude of the church. It's a
Right.
very late development
Mhm.
that the idea of democracy of any kind was really sort of promoted within the Catholic magisterium.
That's true. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you could say certainly within the Catholic tradition, there's a strong insistence on just monarchy, right?
Uh-huh.
And drawing the limits of just monarchy. I would want to contend that all Christian monarchies have always been constitutional monarchies, maybe not in the way that we think of it today, but that in anywhere. I mean, I'm most familiar with England, but in any place like England, there were limits, right, on what the monarch could do, of all sorts, moral, practical,
Hmm.
political, legal. Almost every coronation oath involves the king promising to uphold the laws and customs of the realm, right?
Right.
That he wasn't seen as somebody who could just do whatever he wanted.
And if he
Um,
did, if he emerged as a tyrant, the church
mm,
actually endorsed, under extreme circumstances, tyrannicide.
sure, sure, and it
Right.
happened too. Like we know,
Uh-huh.
like there are kings who lost their throne because they overshot.
Uh-huh.
They went too far. I mean, one thing you could definitely say. I'll give you two thoughts here about why this is particularly attractive to me. Maybe historically was particularly attractive to Christians. One is just a general philosophical argument that you find in a lot of the mirror of princes argument, form of literature. We have Thomas Aquinas's De Regno, but there are many other
Mhm.
versions of this language, of this kind of literature, which are the Mirror of Princes is like a little handbook that you write to sort of teach the prince how he ought to rule, right?
Uh-huh.
And one of the arguments, most customary, and this actually goes also back to John of Salisbury, is that the idea of imitating God, imitating nature, right, in the sense of unity of rule, right? That there needs to be, at the end of the day, in any organization, any community, in any society, there needs to be some source of unity. That unity can be the end and the purpose, and that's good. But
Mhm.
even better if you have sort of both a unity in the end and in the agent. So that just at a practical level, right? I mean, any corporation, for example, you're gonna have a CEO, right? You're gonna
Mhm.
have, a chief executive officer, to put it in that kind of language, who finally says, and we shall do this option, right?
Uh-huh.
Of the various options that are there. If you've ever been on a committee, right?
Mhm.
We have been, right? You know, that
Yeah.
at some point, you need resolution, right? And
Right. Right.
and
You can't just
sometimes maybe
endlessly talk.
that's right. That's right. And sometimes you might be able to reach a consensus that's so clear that you don't need sort of an executive intervention, but the other times you do.
Mhm.
And you can see, one of the advantages, at least in principle, of a monarchy is there's a unity there that I think we kind of lack in a republic.
Uh-huh.
Um, that's not to say that there aren't other forms of unity that a republic could have, right?
Mhm.
In terms of culture, religion, um, ethnos, ethos, or whatever. Like, but there is a kind of sense of like, here's the king, right? And the king or the monarch or the sovereign is one person, right?
Mhm.
And we're all devoted and loyal to that one person, even if we might fight underneath that one person, right?
Uh-huh.
If you don't have that one person, then you're kind of like where we are now, like in our current republic, right?
Yeah.
Where we're just like, there's no unity over the parties.
You know what's
There's
really interesting?
just
Yeah.
factions,
What's really interesting, that's right. What's really interesting is, and I began to see this during the Obama administration, more during the Trump administration. Um, it's that, the guy you didn't vote for, you don't really recognize as legitimate or something, right?
right,
And
yeah.
and so,
Not my president kind of thing.
not my president, right? That
Yeah,
phrase,
right.
you see bumper stickers, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
And literally that's not true, right?
yeah,
Constitutionally. I mean, in some way you might say, go pound dirt. Yeah, 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 he is
right,
the
right,
president, right? But
yeah,
emotionally and psychologically and culturally, you're totally right, Rich.
yeah. Right. Now, here's the thing, right? So here's the flip side of it.
Mhm.
The people who do like that president, right? They might come out with phrases like you know, stop dishonoring our president.
Mhm.
And what they're intuitively grasping at is actually the value of a monarch, right?
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Mhm.
and you've got to have you've got to rally around something, but you can't
Mhm.
really rally around a president in the way that you could rally around a monarch, because the
Yeah,
president is elected every 4 years or every,
sure.
I mean, you the whole point is if you don't like him, you could kick him out.
You can get rid of them, right? Yeah, that's
Whereas the
right.
bar
That's
for
right.
doing that in a monarchy is extremely high.
Yeah. And the presidency, I would actually say in the United States has become, I think under like the idea for Washington's vision, I don't get too distracted here by this, but I mean, I think Washington's vision of the presidency was supposed to be sort of like that, right?
Uh-huh.
That the presidency was almost kind of above the fray and
Yeah.
kind of intervenes when necessary, but really sort of has this kind of moral standing for the nation. Oh, were it so, right?
Yeah.
But I think you're right, especially the temporality of it. I mean, it's 4 years and it's gone, and 4 years and gone, and then as the power of the presidency has grown, right? Of course, the polemics and the partisanship around the presidency have also grown, right?
Right.
Um, a second idea maybe that makes so unity is one, right?
Hmm.
Idea. A second thing that I think might be attractive to Christians about monarchy historically is it's kind of abstract and hard to baptize a state,
Hmm.
right? Like, or a constitution or a bureaucracy, right? There's no, you could maybe try to design a Christian constitution, right? But still, it's kind of a piece of paper with a set of rules. You know what I mean? Whereas you can baptize a Christian man, right? You can baptize a man, right? A human being, right? And you
Yeah.
can, and by doing so, make the sovereign Christian,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. It totally does. When you do that, right, you at least in theory
Mm-hmm.
get a kind of guarantee and promise, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the exercise of that person's authority will be restrained within the moral
Right.
bounds of Christendom.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I
I
mean, I
mean,
think
people are
that's the,
fallible, so there's no guarantee
of
really,
course. Yeah.
but at least
And
you
that's,
get a pledge, right?
yeah, you get a pledge, and it's symbolized, right, by the anointing,
Yeah,
right,
they're
that
actually
Christian
anointed,
kings,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
receive. And there, I mean, you're taking on in a really vocational way,
Yeah.
right? I am. This is my Christian task, right? The way
Yeah.
I am going to live out my Christian vocation, my baptismal vows, is as ruler and king.
Yeah.
And again, I'm going to, be guided, at the very least, be guided by divine law, sacraments, gifts of the Holy
Yeah.
Spirit, and all of that in my rulership.
So really, it's akin to, right? It's akin to taking religious vows.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I think that's right. And akin to being the father of a family. I mean, I think,
Mhm.
the pater familias, the, Christian version of the pater familias, the way you live out your Christian vows, your Christian, your baptismal status, right,
Mhm.
is as, right, the leader of your family and that sort of thing. Yeah, that's um those analogies, right? Those are really concrete, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, this is why I think, so often, monarchs are often thought of as the, referred to as the father kind of figure of the realm, especially when it's a king. Um, that's, that's not like super abstract,
Mhm.
right? Or conceptual, right? Like, okay, I've got the fathers of the family, and they need to rule the family in a way that's Christian, and they need to take care of temporal things, but they also need to look to eternal things, right?
Yeah.
Oh, and we have something similar here, So I mean, I think that's part of the attraction too.
Yeah. So let me offer a third idea, right? For why it is that monarchy is appealing to Christendom. And that is its pyramidal structure, right? So, the church has I would say the dominant and really most coherent model, in my view, for the organization of Christendom is that of a sort of pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this in the letters of Saint Ignatius of Antioch, as far as the church itself.
I see. Okay.
Right. So the liturgy draws the populace into God the Father through what? Through the clergy, the bishop, the patriarch, right? Christ himself. So you imagine like the church is structured this way, right? A bunch of priests and then bishops and then patriarchs and Christ on the very top, who takes us into the bosom of the Father. And that participation in Eucharistic communion is climbing up that pyramid, being one person being taken up into the next, into the next, into the next. And the social organization, then the secular organization, then comes to sort of bear the stamp of Christianity in a similar way. Right. So there's if Christianity is about restoring communion and overcoming the problem of dissolution of the human family due to sin, right, monarchy is a good model for establishing that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I like the use of the phrase there, communion. Because I think it's so interesting. Our form of polity at this point, right, is so conceptual and abstract, right? It's almost as if there's no such thing as the nation anymore, right? As if it was a natus, right? So that there's some sort of common birth, right? It's almost purely legally defined, right? Purely and almost purely conceptual, right? So it has very little to do with, at least the theoretical way we talk about it, the fact that you're from a certain people in a certain place, right? There's very little that's concrete to it. Whereas if you look at the way, like you say, the church is structured, again, this would be a spiritual level, but there's real relations there, right? Ultimately one of the real relations there being, the relationship of the Son to the Father, right? And then we're incorporated into the Son, right? And then we become sons of the Father, right? And as such, brothers and sisters to one another, right? So that there's this whole set of real relations, right, that undergird, right, the reality of the church. That fits very well, I think, with a monarchical scheme, kind of as you're suggesting, right? I mean, think of the real relationships that are involved in at least historic, again, not just every model you could have, but the historic Christian monarchies, right, have been familial and hereditary, right? And sometimes there have been some sort of fantastical notions about the heredity right of kings, that maybe they're descended from specific stock that gives them there's something special about that. I mean, I think that's sort of not that persuasive, obviously. It's
actually, I mean, you see that in the ancient pagan world.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
But it's not really. That's not the way Christians have tended to think about it.
That's right. Yeah. Or at least should not. And but what we can say is the reality is, that certain families come to the fore, and because of their service to the common good, at least maybe even in fairly rough forms, if you're talking about early medieval periods, but eventually, sort of ennobled by law and custom, that political authority, the seat of political authority, the subject in which political authority resides, right, is one that's embedded in something that's real, not just chosen, right? not just something that's up to almost kind of a consumer mentality,
Right.
but something that's real, right? Namely family relationships.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, into these kind of arguments against monarchy that sort of began, in the late, middle Enlightenment period, and maybe even earlier. There might be some fringe, anti-monarchical movements or thoughts, but why should the luck of birth? There was kind of like well, you're no more qualified than anybody else from the luck of birth, kind of thing. But I think, in retrospect, that makes some sense. Maybe like it doesn't, just because you're born to so and so, why does that mean you should be king? But on the other hand, you also think, well, just because you're really persuasive, does that mean you should be the king, right? I think in retrospect, we've learned that consumer politics, to put it that way, maybe doesn't have much,
Let me ask you this
obviously that much better than hereditary title, right?
Let me ask you this question, right? Are there some things in life that ought not to be the subject of choice?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Right. And I think the model of monarchy presses that question. And I think one of the reasons we as Americans have such a difficult time with monarchy, ignoring the fact that when we were actually working on our Constitution, monarchy was one of the models that was considered.
Sure.
Okay? I mean, it wasn't considered ridiculous, right?
No, it was a legitimate option.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I think we have such a difficult time with understanding monarchy is because we've sort of inherited this Enlightenment idea of social contract theory, right? Social atomism.
Right.
Whereas you, the individual, we got a bunch of individuals running around, and we negotiate the relationships to which we commit ourselves. Monarchy actually doesn't buy that, right? It doesn't.
Right.
It's not on that model.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, right, to think about in those terms, Rich, because I mean, if there's anything that characterizes our contemporary society, it's that everything should be subject to choice. I mean, right down to your gender and to your I mean, like, in spite of nature and physiology, right? I mean, one of the things that Kant, lays out as part of one of the markers for modernity, right, is that freedom involves a transcendence of nature, right? Where my Aristotelian bones, rebellious. But whereas from a Christian monarchist point of view, right? Again, I recognize that there are weaknesses in any regime, but has the opposite to say, both for the subjects but also for the monarch, right? Like you don't you don't compete. You're not supposed to compete to be the monarch, right? Yeah, that's a matter of hereditary right. And so if you're the sixth son, that's not going to be your job. And whether you like it or not, if you're the second son and you kind of wish you were the sixth son, right? You're kind of like, I would rather be a poet,
right?
Like, too bad for you. Like that's your job. It's your duty. And that ties in all sorts of things about, I mean, again, you think about it, family is ordained by God. It's part of nature. It's part of the created order. It's part of the sacramental order.
And there are all kinds of implications for the fact that this is the family into which you were born.
That's right. Yeah.
That's true of the monarch as it is for anybody else.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of the things that monarchy affirms for the culture, right? So let's look at that actually in light of the concrete situation of the present royal family in England. So you had Queen Elizabeth's uncle had been king for about a year before he abdicated for very personal reasons, because there were things he wanted that he couldn't have as king.
Right. Yeah.
And that put Queen Elizabeth's father on the throne, right?
Okay.
And he was very upset about that fact. And it was enormously scandalous for England. The you know, there were some pretty deep scars and bad feelings over that. And one wonders, you look at the life of Queen Elizabeth, and she ascended to the throne at the age of 25 and reigned until she was 96. 70-year reign. And all that time you wonder, well, how old does she need to get before she steps down? I kind of personally think, I don't know for sure, but I personally think that one of the reasons she became so resolute in assent to duty was the bad model of her uncle.
Sure.
That she did not want to display.
Right. I think that's probably true. And also, I mean, I think that the office isn't just something dispensable. Like,
right.
Oh yeah, like well, it was fun for a while, but now I'm done.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, so strictly speaking, you
duty.
have a choice. You can't be compelled to be the king. And and so you could abdicate. But is that the morally right thing to do? Is that?
Yeah, especially once you tie it to family, right?
Right.
Like I abdicate being a father?
You could abandon your family.
Yeah, but it seems pretty bad, right?
Then you might go to hell.
That's right. And then let's say, probably the more analogous thing is, okay, so you're the son, right? You could abdicate your inheritance, right? You could do that, right? But that would, like, the cases in which that would be acceptable would be pretty rare, right? For the most part, that would be an impious thing to do. Think about it, if you're, especially in older societies, like maybe you're the heir of the family, but you have other family members, that need to be taken care of, right? That sort of thing. Or maybe you have a family business in which many people are dependent upon that business for their welfare, right? You're inheriting not just prosperity maybe for yourself, but also duty, responsibility, right? That goes back to this whole issue, I think, of the virtue of piety and the virtue of living up to unchosen obligations.
Right. That's a concept. I'm telling you, that idea of unchosen obligations is a concept that we as Americans today simply do not grasp anymore. And I think that's a really serious problem. I think that if we can't wrap our heads around that idea again, I'm not sure how much future there is in a society.
Yeah, I think that's true, Richard. I think, there's a lot of different ways to kind of think about that, right? I mean, I remember taking a political survey once, and in there was, as an option, was various ways of thinking about patriotism, right? And one of the options was, well, to be proud of your country is irrational because you didn't choose to be a member of it, right?
Yeah.
And it was just like, wow, now, can you have piety without monarchy? Yeah, I think you can. But certainly monarchy is a powerful symbol, right, of piety, right? Because that's kind of what we're talking about, right? Is, like, by piety, I mean this unchosen obligations, right? Unchosen obligations to God, to your family, and to your country, right? Yeah, those are things you didn't choose. So, but they're things that you are obliged to reverence, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think, first of all, that's like the fourth commandment, right? I guess we could try to scratch out the fourth commandment, but that's not going to be a very Christian thing to do.
That's right.
And I think I just don't think you've got a functional society if you don't have that concept.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, that being said, I think a really practical question would be, of all the political arrangements possible, which in themselves may be good, right? Which among them best conduces to the development of that virtue? And an argument can be made for monarchy.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, especially insofar as it looks very much like family, because it
Yeah.
is family, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean, and you keep keep coming back to that point. Piety makes sense when there's a reality, right, of unmerited gratuity and unmerited um blessings, right?
Hmm.
So you think about, I think I'm blessed to live in my country. Even if it wasn't as good as the United States is, it would still be the case that all the good things in my life, many of them, put it this way, in the aggregate, flow from the community that I'm a member of, right?
Right.
And so I should be grateful, right, to the degree that it has law and order and decent prosperity and all those sorts of things. Those are things that I should be grateful for.
Yeah.
Um, and because there's a reality there, right? And that's what I keep thinking about with this monarchical situation, is the reality of family order, the reality of family relationships, the reality of somebody who has a sacramental relationship with God and then a new kind of relationship with his subjects. That those are all realities, right,
Yeah.
that aren't up to my choice. They're there,
Yeah. And if you're not
uh
thankful for having received them, then you're a bad person.
That's right. The problem's with you. That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I think so. But yeah, those are all, I mean, I think interesting aspects about um, Christian monarchy. You can see how they, why they're attractive. I'll just throw in one last bit here, and then we can maybe wrap up. But it seems, again, it is possible. I mean, thinking as an American, as a patriotic American, it is possible to have personal loyalty to your country, your people, right? That sort of thing. Especially when there's a high degree of unity in a republic, right?
Uh-huh.
As that fragments, it gets harder, I think, to see, it gets harder. It's like, what am I personally loyal to, right? Where is that? Whereas at least, with a Christian monarchy, if the king's at least even just decent, right, there is a kind of loyalty, like a personal loyalty, right, to the person of the king, right? And that's very, again, very concrete,
Yeah.
right? It's not something that's an abstraction. I can say, hey, the king is kind of like my father. He's not always perfect. He's got his problems, et cetera, but he's still my father,
Yeah.
right? And I can be loyal to him in that sort of position. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Right. Yeah. So before we before we kind of wrap up the conversation, though, there are I wanted to ask, the way the monarchy is structured in England today, it's probably what
Mhm.
the most prominent, certainly, remaining monarchy on the globe. And we look at it and we think, well, the monarch is just a figurehead at this point,
Mhm.
lacking any political power at all.
Mhm.
Now, I would say that based upon the conversation we just had, that one could still make a pretty strong argument for the value of the monarchy,
Mhm.
um, even in the absence of any concrete political power. And I think that, when we look at the fact that England could probably very easily dispense with it if they wanted to,
Mhm.
and yet they choose not to do so, it
Mhm.
suggests that they see the value in it. Maybe even if
Mhm.
they couldn't articulate exactly what it is, that they're
Mhm.
obviously they value it, or they would get rid of it.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I wanted to ask you another question, which is, are we wrong in the way we perceive the British monarchy today? Is it completely devoid of any political power?
Well, given the informality of the English Constitution, right, which sounds for me maybe a little weird, but like, they don't have a written constitution in the same way the United
Yeah,
States
it's an
does, right?
ethical constitution.
Yeah, it's a little more fluid and custom based. I think it is possible, that put it this way, a very effective monarch certainly would have a lot of moral persuasion and a
Uh-huh.
lot of moral force. Now you don't know what goes on behind the scenes, in terms of the various political pressures, right,
Hmm.
that go on. But certainly, I think that, um, and Charles even spoke about this, the new king, Charles the third, that, he's the head of the church in England. And I was just kind of surprised. He had a little 8 minute, a little talk. Um, and that's something, actually,
Yeah.
there is a royal board that is still in charge of some of the episcopal appointments. I don't know all of the ins and outs of that, which is
Uh,
very complicated, but there are some of those episcopal appointments that are still up to
and do
the
they
to the
still
monarch.
occupy seats in the House of Lords?
I think so. Yeah, I think
Hmm.
some of them do. Yeah. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of moral force still.
Uh,
If it was the right monarch, it'd have to be somebody like
yeah.
Elizabeth, right, who has this sort of beyond reproach kind of character.
Yeah. And yet she
Um,
never inserted
mm,
herself, to my knowledge.
yeah, very rarely. I mean, only in the ways that were obviously and incontestably good, right?
Uh,
That is, say, like um, her activities during World War II, and in the post-war kind of leading, then she
yeah.
was princess, I guess, but then and once we became queen, sort of leading kind of, more ways with the restitution or, rebuilding
Mhm.
of England, those sorts of things. She always was a Christian and always said that she was a Christian in pretty explicit terms. Now, maybe she could have done more. But she did pretty straightforwardly say, that she believed in Jesus Christ and the gospel and all those sorts of things.
Every law that Parliament passes and every law that's passed in the parliaments of
Mm-hmm.
the other countries in the Commonwealth come across the monarch's desk.
Mm-hmm.
And there's supposed to be some sort of response from the monarch, right?
Right.
Does the monarch
Yeah.
have actual veto power or what?
I mean, I think under the current thing that would be cause a constitutional crisis, right?
Uh-huh.
Under the way it is now. Could it, like, abstractly? I think, yeah. I mean, I think it would be cool. I mean, if you're asking me to be speculative, I think it would be very cool for the monarch to exercise veto.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I think it'd be very cool for the House of Lords to do the same thing. The House of Lords has, on occasion, voted to veto something passed in the House of Commons.
Hmm.
They all, basically the House of Commons just gets to override them by voting it again. They don't have a
Hmm.
2/3 kind of override, say that has to be the case, say, in the Senate. If you
Uh-huh.
did, that'd be kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think these are pretty speculative
Yeah.
possibilities. There are possibilities. One wonders what kind of situation would be. I mean, it is what I have recently thought about this just a little bit, because Liz Truss, I believe, is the new prime
Yeah.
minister of England, and nobody thinks that she's up to the job. I mean,
We'll
she's
find
like,
out. We'll
yeah,
find out.
she's like a just most nondescript sort of functionary in the background. Um, so yeah, I think we'll see about that. I mean, is it always some sort of disaster possible in which a monarch could get more a little more say, a little more? I mean, but this way, the structure's there. You know,
Yeah, I mean, like, am I
so
wrong in thinking that at least in theory,
in
the
theory,
monarch
yeah,
could dissolve parliament?
sure, yeah. I mean, and that's happened,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
Um, and so it's been a long, long time,
I mean,
right?
the
But
circumstances would have to be pretty extreme to justify that, right?
sure,
But at
sure,
least it's sort of a nuclear option.
yeah. It'd be interesting to see what happened.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
that
Right.
would be you could say it and then you'd see what happened.
Well, there are, I mean, there are some questions
That's
you don't ask because you don't want to know the answer, right?
right. That's right. Yeah.
But
That's right. In light of what you were talking about, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was going to say though that if one of the real functions of the monarch is to ensure cultural continuity, to sort of
Hmm.
preserve the culture,
Hmm.
um, I look at the reign of Elizabeth II, and
Hmm.
sadly, as much as I admire the woman,
Uh,
I have to wonder if she was successful in that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think
And
you'd have to say as a matter of results, no.
uh-huh.
Did she do her bit? I think, yeah. Could she have done more? I don't really know, because I don't
we
know
don't know.
what's going on behind the
So
scenes. I
the
mean,
prudential question, right, of whether she should have exercised some nuclear option at some point in her reign to kind of prevent things from going in the direction that they did, where the Christian culture in England is now almost extinct. Could she have done it? Should she have tried it? Well, we don't really know the answers to those questions. We can't know the answers to those questions, I guess. But I have to. I wonder about them.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure she did too. I mean, I would imagine. I think, yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, I think interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've sort of made my own sort of speculations. I've kind of thought about those sorts of things, and but you know, it might have been helpful for her to do that, to just sort of protest, right, and then see, sort of see what happens, how the chips fall.
Yeah.
It might have been worth it. I mean, I think one thing that's kind of interesting in our own sort of ecclesial polity, right? This, we're wrapping up here, but not to go down a rabbit hole too much, but the abdication by Benedict, right, is interesting in these terms, not that in the sense that he couldn't abdicate, right? I mean, it has happened and he did it, and so it can be, right? I mean, it's not outlawed, right? But it does seem in some way to kind of like take a little bit of the awe off of the, what I mean? A little bit of the majesty, right, of the thing. Does that make sense?
I do, and I mean, that's really the thing. Well, you know that I'm a pretty strong Ratzingerian, right? I mean, my theological perspective is very closely aligned to his. This is one of two things about which I'm in strong disagreement with him on. The first is his love of cats, and the second is his belief that he should have abdicated, or whatever you want to call it, step down from the chair of Peter. I think he shouldn't have done that. I mean, I don't get to make that call, but but like our conversation here today, I think says everything that we need to say about why it would have been better had he not done that.
Sure, kind of like with Elizabeth not stepping down, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it did sort of add something to it, that it just kept going, right? And so that she carried it all the way through. She'd received this office, and she carried this office all the way through to the end.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, well, that's good. Yeah. Cool.
Well, yeah, that's probably a good place for us to stop this discussion. And anyways, good discussion.
Yeah.
So thanks for your contribution. I'm sure our listeners learned an awful lot.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot, Rich. It was a lot of fun to think about. And I hope everybody found the comments useful and edifying. Until next time, God bless.